during the 1820s in particular, you saw a large movement of Americans who had moved to Mexico, even though slavery is outlawed, or not moved to, and moved to Texas, not Mexico itself, but Texas, the Mexican province of Texas. And what they would do is they would sort of go to Mexico City. They would, convert to Catholicism, at least for the day, and promise to free their slaves. But then they'd come back to their plantations and ranches, several hundred miles north, from under the eye of the Mexican government, and really do whatever they wanted. Keep their slaves, sort of not practice Catholicism, practice the whatever religion, they were a member of before. And the Mexican government was usually so far away and also so disorganized and so busy with, all sorts of other things, all sorts of other problems that had come about from it being such a sort of new state and not a very wealthy one, that they oftentimes sort of paid no attention. And so just to give you an example of how people in the South begin to flock to Texas, in 1830, there are 7,000 Americans in Texas and 3,000 Mexicans. So 1830, just 9 years after the Mexico gains independence, just 9 years after that, Americans already outnumber Mexicans in Texas. Okay, then in 1835, just 5 years later, there are 27,000 Americans in Texas. I'm not sure exactly how many Mexicans there were. Not many more than that original 3,000. I can tell you that much. Along with that 27,000 Americans, there were over 3,000 slaves in Texas. And so the rules about having to free your slaves were, sort of completely being, sort of ignored and flaunted by these Americans. And in many ways, the Americans that lived in Texas still thought of themselves as Americans, even though they weren't in the United States or part of the United States, or at that point they had, become a citizen of Mexico. Finally, when a new government comes to power through a coup under a Mexican general named Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, when he comes to power, Santa Anna seeks to reassert Mexican control over Texas and to force Texans to abide by the rules in terms of practicing Catholicism and freeing slaves and this sort of stuff. And when he tries to reassert control over Texas, the Americans, who had become very used to doing whatever they wanted in Texas over the previous 15 years, rebel and proclaim Texas an independent republic on March 2nd, 1836. 4 days later, on March 6th, 1836, Santana's army wipes out the garrison of Texans who are defending the Alamo in what's today San Antonio. Santa Anna completely wipes out the Americans almost to a man. They're almost all killed, right? And at a later battle, not long after that, Santa Anna massacres 371 Texans, thinking it would end the rebellion. But in reality, the sort of brutality he employs at San Antonio, at the Alamo, and at later battles sort of backfires on Santa Anna, because when the news of the sort of complete destruction of these Texans reaches the U.S. and reaches newspapers in the U.S. within weeks, thousands of Americans from places like Tennessee and Kentucky and elsewhere stream into Texas to sort of avenge these Americans basically who have been killed by this Mexican dictator. And at the Battle of San Jacinto, a few weeks later, Santa Anna's army is completely routed by an army under the command of Sam Houston, and he is defeated, and the Texans, and this is the thing that a lot of people, when they talk about Texas, the whole idea of Texas being a whole other country, and that sort of thing, they sort of leave out this part, and that is that as soon as the Texas Rebellion is won by the Texans, they immediately apply to the United States for annexation, okay, i.e. to be part of the United States. From the very beginning, the Texans want to be part of the United States. The problem is the United States does not want them, okay? And the reason the United States does not want them, particularly Andrew Jackson at the end of his presidency, and in 1836 he's about to leave office, and his successor, Martin Van Buren, want nothing to do with the question of Texas, of making Texas part of the United States, has really very little to do with Texas or Texans or how they feel about them or anything like that. It has to do with the idea of dredging up that old, 20 by now, 15 to 20-year-old dispute that was caused by Missouri trying to enter the Union as a slave state. Okay, because everybody knows that if Texas enters the Union, they've already got slaves there. It's going to be a slave state, and it's going to bring up that whole really ugly episode once again that threatened to, practically, tear the entire Union apart. And so the Jackson and Van Buren administrations just want to avoid that completely. They don't even want to get into discussing that because of how ugly that fight could be. And so they just ignore the time. They refuse to take up the issue of annexing Texas. And so the Texans are, for the most part, sort of forced to declare themselves an independent republic. Okay, although they are, in no way are they sort of prepared for what it would take to be their own country, to create their own infrastructure, their own government, all that sort of stuff. I mean, and they struggle along for nearly 10 years, sort of limp along as their own country until someone is elected who does not have that kind of fear, and that is in 1844, the Democratic candidate is a man named James Knox Polk, and Polk, he's sort of a dark horse candidate. He's somebody who runs and is not considered to be really the favorite, but through various things that happen, scandals that attack other candidates, and things that go Polk's way, Polk ends up becoming, eventually one of the main candidates for president, and winning the Democratic nomination. And Polk is an ardent expansionist. And what I mean by this is Polk's entire platform in the 1844 election is based upon the idea that if he's elected, one of the things he will do immediately is annex Texas and make it part of the United States. He also claims there's a dispute also that's gone on for a long time between the U.S. and Canada over where it is that Oregon begins and where Oregon ends and Canada begins. And Polk claims that basically he'll go to war against the British to extend the boundaries of what was the Oregon Territory into to include what's today Vancouver, British Columbia, which is part of Canada today. And he says he'll go to war against the British to do that. He also threatens that he'll, sort of go to war against the Mexicans to make the boundary of Texas the Rio Grande. And so he very sort of blustery sort of fellow, campaigns on this idea that he is all about manifest destiny and expanding the size of the United States, and that he has a right to do so. And so the election of 1844 in many ways becomes a referendum on the annexation of Texas. If you want to annex Texas and make Texas part of the United States, well, then you vote for Polk. If you don't, you don't. And Polk ends up winning. And one of the first things he does once he's elected president is to annex Texas and make it part of the United States. We'll talk about the other stuff that he does, in particular a war that he starts in order to gain more territory for the United States. We'll talk about that in class when I finish this lecture.